Welcome, everyone. My name's Glenn McKnight. I'm with Bob Bell. Both of us are amateur historians or citizen historians, right, Bob? So we've been doing a lot of stuff over the years. But for you to understand our philosophy, what I want to do is share my screen. This is a series, roughly 2 minutes long, of history quotes. So let me just pull it up. Here we go. So, Bob, what I like to do is I play. You can see it, okay, right?
Yes.
Okay, I don't need the sound, so I'm going to take that down. So we're going to go through each of these quotes. And so the first one is from Oscar Wilde. Anybody can make history, only a great man can write it. Any reaction to that? You like it, dislike it? Just,
It's a wee bit vague.
okay,
Um,
doesn't speak to you.
doesn't speak to me.
Okay, here's the next one. And I'll pause it again. Okay, history does not repeat itself. The historians repeat one another. Kind of an interesting perspective. I don't know. I've never heard of this quote. Have you heard of this
Yes, yeah,
before?
I've heard it. I've heard a variation that history doesn't repeat itself, but historians do. But it's true, but it's also not true. It's
Okay.
often a facile way of looking at things that that I don't necessarily agree with.
Okay. Here we go. Okay. This is probably the most famous one. I think we all have seen this. Those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
I strongly agree with that one. I think there's all sorts of lessons we learn, and we should learn from history.
That's a big question mark. We are living through after yesterday. Yesterday was the acquittal of the former President Trump on his second impeachment, and history is going to judge those who voted for it, the acquittal, and those who did not vote. Also, one of the things over the last year, we've both have been very much, I guess, a hostage to the COVID-19. It's astounding how after the first big pandemic in our modern history 100 years ago, virtually you ask the average person, what do you know about it? And do you have any relatives that died in it? Like everybody is clearly absent from any
Well, I think you should
awareness.
add what it is. I think probably a lot of the listeners here, even at this point, don't know about the Spanish flu
Yeah.
and how many people are affected. It really dropped from our collective history. You and I knew about it, but very few people that I know ever talked about it.
Yeah, but those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Like that just resonates so strongly on the
Yep, and
pandemic,
this is proof of it.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't know this guy. I know the quote, but I'll have to make a point of looking into who Santaniana sounds like an Indian name. Santaniana. Do you know who that is? I'm not.
no, I don't actually.
Okay, we'll have to make a point of bookmarking him. Okay, moving on to the next quote. Oh, he's back again. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Kind of variation. Okay, here
Yes,
we go. We get our ethics from our history and judge our history by our ethics. Well,
yep,
interesting. Interesting. I agree with
yeah, I
that.
like that one.
Yeah. Okay, next one. The value of history is that it teaches us what man has done and thus what man is. Now, that's
Very much so.
wow. It says a
I
lot
know
of. Go ahead.
um, Richard Flint is a modern speaker, and he has a variation on that behavior never lies.
Hmm.
Um, what people say is one thing, but what they actually do tells you very much about what the person is.
Hmm.
And the same as history. When you look at what people have done, it tells you about who they are and what their ethics are.
Right. Okay. We agree on that one. We haven't really disagreed on anything yet, but let's move on. Okay, a very controversial character, very bright guy, Herbert
Yeah,
Hoover. The supreme purpose of history is a better world. I don't.
exactly.
Wow, I don't know. You're big on that.
Yeah.
Um,
If we you put your hand on the stove lid, you get burned.
Mhm.
That's history in its simplest. You remember that, you don't do that again. If you forget what we've learned in the past, you'll keep putting your hand on that stove lid.
But I think we fail to remember that. We fail again and again. Like we must be really dumb primates or something, but we just don't seem to learn
Mhm.
from there's so many other things that get in the way in terms of personal vendettas or personal gain. It seems that I think there's something missing in this quote, but you know what, we'll
Oh, he's a great man. Archie Bunker loved him. Remember, he uh, referenced him in the sign-in to the Archie Bunker show years ago, All in the Family.
ah
Yeah.
okay, there we go.
Anybody that Archie Bunker loved, it couldn't be all bad.
There we go. Going on. Okay, the study of history is the beginning of wisdom. Well, you can't disagree with that one.
No.
The history of the world is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom. Hegel.
Yes.
The history is a science, no more, no less. I'm going to stop right there.
Mhm.
I don't know what he means by that. History is a science, no more, no less. Yes, it's a social science according to
Yes.
definition, but I don't see it as a science. But what do you think on that?
I'm in between on that one. Be honest, you should have a scientific method of how you draw your conclusions.
Mhm.
So on that sense, I would, but so much of it is subjective.
Yeah.
And so is it, but even your subjective should be based on principles, and the
Mhm.
principles should be established in a scientific way. So I would say I'm in between on that one.
Okay. I think that's a product of his times.
Yes.
I think he's coming from a determinist perspective. Just looking at his dress, he looks like he's from the turn of the century, and I think there is so much of our historical approach and analysis is a product of like you would never see a critical treatise on the First World War about colonialism and the philosophy of colonialism. Really, imperialism dominates much of the historical reporting back then. Now, I think we look back at it and with a little bit more broader scope.
Yes.
So yeah,
I think what often they science wasn't science.
yeah,
Their hypotheses were wrong.
right. So we're going to sort of put a question mark on that one. Next one. Okay. History is philosophy, teaching by example and also by warning. Maybe
I like that.
That's I have to look into this guy too, because I think there's more to this. It's context, right? So
Yes.
I'll repeat it. History is philosophy, teaching by example and also by warning. Yeah, I think that gets back to learning from history's mistakes, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And coming up, history teaches everything, including the future.
A wee bit deterministic, I think in the short run, yes. But the long run, like when I first heard about the Wuhan situation, I sort of saw an epidemic based on, but how it was going to play out, we can't say. But short term, yeah, it taught a lot, knowing about the Spanish flu.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm again not sold on this one. I'm not
You're always right. It's okay to be wrong on some.
I just think I think you cannot predict the future. I think there's history repeats itself. No, not entirely. There's so many other indicators and factors that can shape the outcome. that's not going to be. I don't necessarily agree with this one, so
Yeah.
I'm just.
I think in broad brush, if you take it too narrow, I would agree. But in a broad brush, you can sort of say, "Ooh, this could develop."
Mm-hmm.
You can't say it will develop precisely, but it can sort of predict the future or predict futures for you.
Right.
Yep.
I think it could give some pattern,
Yes.
but it's not deterministic.
No.
A plus B, pattern is not the case. Okay, here we go. Abraham Lincoln. Here's a victim of history. History is not history unless it is truth. Oh boy,
Mm-hmm.
that's a loaded one. We've seen a ton of this stuff where revisionist history has come in and manipulated the facts. I don't necessarily think it's a version of truth, but not. I
Well,
don't think.
sometimes it is, and that's where, in a way, his phrasing is correct if he's saying that history is truth, but sometimes what is presented as history is not truth. And stories are created, false histories are created to justify points. And
Well, we've
I
seen.
think I'm taking it, he's saying that that's not history,
Yeah,
that's propaganda.
I think, given this perspective, I think he would look at the South after the Civil War and how they had this concept that it was a noble cause, and that they perpetuated a concept of history, especially the ladies of the Confederacy, and they built um, relics of the past everywhere throughout the South, and we ended up having Jim Crow law and the whole bit. I would be very interested. Unfortunately, didn't live to see it, but it would have been a totally different situation, I'm sure. But what we've seen, even in the recent history, where they've tried to take down Confederacy statues, people would, be very upset, saying it's our history, right? That they didn't want any of those icons to be removed, and in many
But we've
ways,
also in recent times brought out, I know I have a book in my collection of horrible images. In fact, I haven't even looked through the whole book because it's disturbing to look at, of the various lynchings. Well, a lot of that stuff was sort of not talked about,
right.
But now that's coming out. So I think the truth is coming out more. It was
Well,
sort of,
it's interesting you mentioned that, because there was something that's called the 1619 Project, the New York Times brought out, talking about the history of slavery in the US. And former President Trump created this committee who went and said, let's look at the positive. And he created this concept, and it was supposed to be a sort of almost like an amusement park of American heroes, such as Disney, such as other great Americans, Henry Ford and everything else. But I am sure they're going to paint a history of those individuals with really just one brush. Like they're not going to
and
get
a
in.
lot of those people you mentioned have some dark sides, to put it mildly, as well. But anyways, we should go on to the next one.
Okay, next one. Sometimes it takes a while. Okay, here we go. I like this one. History is not melodrama, even if it usually reads like that, by Robert Penn Warren.
Yeah. Sometimes it is melodramatic, though.
Yeah. Well, I think, remember when you were in high school, people would say history was dull and boring? Yeah.
That's due to the unfortunate fact of some of the historians that write are dull and boring.
Well, yeah. I think they could make anything dull and boring. I think that's part of their personality.
I had some great history teachers in school. It made it quite exciting and interesting.
Oh, I think you're jumping the gun there on that one, and you better pencil that down. What motivated you? Who was your inspiration? So let's touch on to that. Don't forget that point after we do these quotes. Okay, we're about halfway through. We'll leave Robert Penn Warren. Oh, he's back again. Okay, history cannot give us, I can't see the
A
top
program for the future.
for the future, but it can give us a fuller understanding of ourselves and of our common humanity so that we can better face the future. Hmm. Hmm.
Excellent.
I think there's some almost that's a quotable quote for us. We should screen capture this one.
Mhm.
And that's what I think is an essence of what we're going to try to talk about in this podcast is that grounding people where they are in the geophysical space of Oshawa and Durham region and in Canada and the world, to understand yourself relative to your neighbors, relative to your neighborhood, relative to the community of neighborhoods, is really an important aspect of a sense of being human.
Mhm.
And I think this is quite intriguing. We'll have to I'm not going to do the vote yet, but I think this one stands out for me. Okay, going on to the next one.
Well, he's got a good first name too.
You mean Pen Warren? Yeah.
No, Warren, Robert.
O.W. Holmes Jr. For some reason, I was thinking of that mass murderer Holmes in Chicago, but his name wasn't O.W. Holmes, but that crazy guy. He was like the American Jack the Ripper. Okay, history has
Oliver Wendell Holmes?
I think so, which is
Yeah.
icon in the U.S. History. History has to be rewritten because history is the selection of those threads of causes or antecedents that we are interested in. Okay, doesn't do much for me. How about you?
A little too legalistic for me.
Okay. Well, I think it's illustrating the dichotomy we have in our approach. Okay, moving forward. And another philosopher, history is not the accumulation of events of every kind which happens in the past. It is the science of human societies. Here we go again. One has to have a really good understanding of 19th century philosophy, and I'm really not sure what he's getting at here. I'm sure there's
no. I think it's not just what he's saying. It's not just a list, but it's an understanding of society.
He could have said it a little bit better.
I don't like this. I don't like the quote.
I don't like the last sentence because it's misnomer. It's similar to that other quote we had about science earlier on.
Yeah.
I think
the verbiage is outdated.
Yeah, because I think it's again getting back to the if you got this event and these personalities, you get this, and that's what predictable science is. You throw a ball up, it falls to the ground. Gravity is a proven, a law of nature in physics. But when you say history and you bring it into science, it has predictable laws and rules, and I don't think history follows a predictable set of events. It's not predetermined, I guess. Well, you know what? It's good to have a conversation on this stuff. So I'm going to move on to the next one. Okay. History is a myth that men agree to believe.
No.
Wow.
No. And some histories are like when we talk about the propaganda or the fake news type.
Yeah.
But I think history is more to a science if done right.
Right. Yeah, following certain protocols and
yes,
methodologies.
and trying to look beyond your preconceptions.
Next, by Edward Gibbon, looks like from the Regency period. The voice of history is often little more than the organ of hatred or flattery. Wow. That's a little negative.
Yeah, and again, looking at it as propaganda. Next.
Okay, that's okay. Anonymous. Okay. Historians, it is said, fall into one of three categories: those who lie, those who are mistaken, and those who do not know. Okay, which one are you, Bob?
No, but see, we're amateur historians.
Right.
So we're those that do not lie. We're those that are never mistaken, and we know everything.
That completes it all.
Yeah.
All you have to do is contact us. So that was a little exercise in exploring, and I'll just stop the screen sharing. Um, let's touch on a bunch of stuff there. So we want to have a discussion about how did we get interested in local history or history in general. What are some of the things that fascinate you and myself in terms of local history? And what do we want to achieve with this podcast? So we have about a half hour to complete all of that. So let's start off. You said earlier in this discussion with some of the quotes that you had some fantastic teachers or mentors in your journey on understanding history. Do you want to talk about that?
Wow, that's really, really broad. My family, especially my mother, who was a school teacher, but even before she was a school teacher, was always interested in history and would point us out things and take us to museums. High school, I know I had one teacher, and he was notorious for playing film strips all the time, and like Second World War era ones, but he added the personal element to it. And I knew some local historians. Donald Fox lived around the corner and could tell you who everybody was. Bessie Gannon, same thing. So I knew a lot. Bessie knew everybody to the point it was almost spooky. And she could tell you who was connected and what was involved. And so I've always liked the people aspect of it, but also the location. Living in an older house, in an older neighborhood too. You're certain, the McLaughlins lived right around the corner from us, not too far, a few blocks down, but they were the ones that actually subdivided the land I'm sitting on. And in fact, Sam, I believe, owned this property before the house was built.
So it sounds to me that you had some mentors or people that gave an impression that history was valuable.
Yes.
It lit a spark in you, and I can see some of the artifacts behind you. You're a infamous collector, Bob. But besides books and artifacts and all the things that you enjoy.
But you learn and you can have fun with history. You see the speaker right up here? Does that look like an Alexa?
No, it doesn't look like an Alexa.
Alexa, what time is it?
The time is 1:27.
Oh, you put your Alexa right inside it. Oh, that's cute, Bob.
Yeah.
It's fusing the two, and it's actually it's probably enhancing the volume as well, because
yeah, it does.
Oh, that's cute. That's cute.
So, but you can have fun, and to me, that's history. You can have fun with it. I put it in without destroying. That's a 1920s Atwater Kent trumpet horn for a radio, and so I managed to get it in there without altering it.
Now, Bob, you and I have done a bunch of local history stuff, and we've done presentations on the First World War, the War of 1812. We did a film series for schools. We did lots and lots of presentations to
ham radio.
The ham radio group, which led to a tour at the I think the Hamilton Air Space Museum.
Yes, and the Ham Museum.
Yeah, the Ham Museum that's located there as well.
Hammond.
Sorry.
Well, the Hammond Museum in Guelph.
Right. I didn't get to that, but I know you told me about that. But it looks like you got an interest when you were a kid or in high school, and you met people, and obviously your mother. But my understanding, and I might be wrong on this, but my impression is that history it's not a required course throughout high school, and it's only 4 years in Ontario now. And I believe it's one course they have to take, 1 year, grade 9. I don't think they have to take it past that.
I'm not sure. It's been a year or two since I've been in high school.
Yeah, but I believe there's if they're, it's minimalist. Now, people could
Yes.
take other additional history courses if they want, but I think what's lacking is any history training, and we can get into a lot of other stuff that's missing in the curriculum. But I think there is almost, if the parents aren't interested and there isn't those mentors, and it's not being taught in schools, so they can hear somebody who's not the boring, facts, the big battle approach. Where do they get this inspiration to take interest? So do you think, looking now on your community and talking to different people, do you think we have a loss of appreciation of local history, or where do we do interventions so that making sure that young people take interest in, or any person really take interest in the local history?
Well, I think there's been a mistake and a dropping of the ball. We've allowed it to become too institutionalized. And I know you believe in it even more than myself. You're on the internet all the time and taking courses. I'm a believer in lifelong education.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so many people think education as being in front of a qualified teacher, whatever that is. And and no aspersions against teachers, but I think anybody can be a teacher. And I think we all should be, but also we all should be students. And I think the more important thing of the two is to be students at all times and actively going out and trying to find out about history. It tells us about how we got where we are, and it gives us, as some of the quotes indicated, ideas for the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's look at one example. They started a campaign, and I think other cities have done it as well. They've put a poppy at some of the streets,
Mhm.
and those poppies signify someone who died in one of the two wars, and that they took those names from the cenotaph in downtown Oshawa. And the problem with that is what's the history on that person? What battle did they go in? How did they pass away? What was the results of their family? It's ahistorical. Like, people are living on a street that's named after someone, Bagot or others, and there's no source. They can't go anywhere. The Legion doesn't have this information. The city doesn't have this information. The historical societies don't have this information. So we have a real disconnect. Okay, it's nice to honor those persons who sacrificed in war.
Well, sometimes too, just to correct you, I think sometimes the information is there, but it's not available to the average person in an easily accessible way. I don't think you should have to contact and pay for a research fee. I think a lot of this with the digital age could be put up on the internet. You could start a wiki about the local history and have people contribute to it. Like Facebook actually does a phenomenal job on some of the Facebook groups. And you put up questions there and it's amazing the history you can pull out.
You made a good point, because everybody's extremely critical of social media, especially Facebook, given the recent American election and the use of hate speech and other things. But you're making a good point how social media, we're all connected by 6 degrees of separation, that you could be on a social media site and connect with individuals who have some knowledge of your own family history. Now,
well, there's that famous quote on Facebook you often see.
Yes.
It's by Abraham Lincoln, and it says, "Don't believe everything you see on Facebook."
Right.
But I think the truth is that you can believe a lot of it, and if you use your common sense and study.
I think you've just brought up another really important point, and I want to illustrate an example in 1 second. But on what you just said, you're using common sense. So using social media without a filter, without some kind of semblance of how to check. It's like the phenomenal phishing situations with the entire whole DNS abuse issues on scams that happen online. But if you are not trained,
Yes.
if you have not learned
How to
on
analyze and
how yeah,
yeah.
and separate.
People confuse critical thinking with criticism. It's two different things. Like some people think you've always got to criticize. No, you've got to analyze and weigh, listen to different sources.
Yeah, and I think we've had way too much of the latter, where there's just this like barking dogs at each other, who shouts the loudest, gets all the marbles sort of thing, and without any really intellectual thought. And I think one of the things we're trying to inspire people with this podcast is that see what we've got inspired by certain quotes that we just showed you, but also say that, we put our money where our mouth is. We not only have done a number of projects, which is to share our knowledge and find the local knowledge. And I want to talk about a couple of examples, but let me just pull up one thing that I'm researching. Remember I told you that in some of the research I've been doing on my own ancestry, that the relatives that came up from that were German, that came across and settled in Pennsylvania, unfortunately being Germans, they were loyal to the German King of England at the time, and like America went through a real disarray after the American Revolution. So those relatives relocated as Empire loyalists to Fort Erie area. What is interesting is in just looking at a newspaper article, it was an article that I stumbled across, and the descendants of the family, and they're called Strom, and they were celebrating their 50th wedding or 60th wedding anniversary in the article, which was nice. But reading into the article, he mentions that his father not only was a UE loyalist, but he was a captain of the 18th Dragoon, and that was a very famous regiment that fought at Lundy's Lane. Now, and then he goes on later to talk about how he fought in the Fenian, the Canadian local Halaman Rifles against the Fenians who attacked Canada after the Civil War. So those are a little bit of history points, and I didn't know these two pieces of information when you and I developed and launched our War of 1812 history project, because what we did is we looked at history that happened here locally on the War of 1812. And for the record, Bob, everybody said there was no history here, right? Remember that? There was no history. So don't look for it, right? Which we proved them wrong. Yes. But I just want to point out to you is that, it's kind of almost scary, it's creepy in us. And why did I take such an interest in War of 1812? It was the anniversary, 200-year anniversary. But what is interesting is that actually not that far back, we have some relatives who served in one of the decisive battles that happened in Upper Canada. So I go, holy cow. So now I'm trying to get the war records from Lundy's Lane Historical Society, that's on Facebook. And I'm going back and forth and seeing if I can cull this information up. But I know in your case, in your own personal history, what have you stumbled across that say, holy cow, what a coincidence?
There's been a number of things. One thing I'm working on right now is one of my ancestors or one of the people I've identified as a possible ancestor might have been a Mayflower, come over on the Mayflower.
Hey, Bob, that had to be a big ship.
But there's a documented individual. Now, I haven't documented for sure that I'm descended from that person. I looked at one source and it was saying definitely, and there's a plausible line of descent to my family. Another source has a slightly, that I've found since, has a slightly different. So I'm going to have to look through and find out exactly which one is correct. But you do learn, and in regard, it doesn't really matter which one turns out to be right. In the process of investigating this, I'm learning about things.
Now, don't you find that when we've interviewed some people who had some stories, remember the interview we did with a gentleman that owned the Home Harbor store?
Yes.
A little guy.
Yeah, Don White.
Yeah, what a wonderful,
Yes.
wonderful gentleman. And
Yes.
and when, you know, what was interesting is he was he wanted his story told, and he wanted to tell to somebody who was interested. And I think that's an important part of history, is the
But
personal
also
stories.
he was very, what shall we say, very humble. And I noticed once my camera, I turned off my camera and turned off the recording. We had a lot more interesting discussion than we had while the camera was on.
I
And there's
don't
a
know.
lot of that. It's a lot of the people that really are the base history. And that's where you get into the selective histories. Some people just don't want their story told, or don't make a big deal out of it. Other ones hold themselves out to be the hero.
You know, one of the things that we when we did the First World War presentations, I was astounded on the after the war. People were fully aware of the impact of that war, but you know, and again, because we did the first War of 1812 and the First World War, we saw many of those people in Oshawa was a tiny place at the time of the War of 1812. But a number of those individuals moved on to become quite seminal in the history of Oshawa, whether in local government or business and whatnot. They had their impact. I could go back and get stories about the War of 1812 fairly easily. And we had a whole bunch of very interesting stories on Thomas Henry and others. But when, yeah, that's another great one. But what's interesting, when we start to look in the same sort of lens of going back and looking at the First World War, so what happened to those guys that came back? We're not talking about those just who passed away. Like there was very little stories. And then when you ask people, you know, did any of your relatives serve in the First World War? Did you have an uncle? Did you have a grandfather? Whatever. Like it was like hitting your head against the wall. Like,
yeah. And some people had a general knowledge that, you know, Grandpa was, but really Grandpa never talked about it. And related to that was the Ukrainian detention. And we were hoping to get some stories about that. The Ukrainians were imprisoned in Canada, and absolute brick wall, because the people that were involved just never talked about it after. And there is some information out, but I think there's a lot more that happened locally, but we were just unable to find anything of substance.
Yeah, because Oshawa was Manchester of the North. There was a significant number of Ukrainians, and at that time, Ukrainians, even though they were fighting with the Russians, as you know, they were one of the allies. But they were treated as part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and they were treated as aliens, and they were imprisoned. And in fact,
I think they were referred to as Galatians.
But what's interesting, and that becomes, I recall looking at the early newspapers, the Oshawa Times, I believe, as soon as the declaration by the Canadian government that the Ukrainians were dangerous, the police chief in Oshawa rounded them up. They deliberately imprisoned the local Ukrainians. And now, one of the things that you look, a number of these Ukrainians were in prison for a number of years after the war, like 4 or 5 years after the war.
Yeah. And then we did the same thing in the Second World War with, there's an excellent book on Saltspring Island and what happened to the Japanese Canadians there. And they were, and these aren't Japanese. These are Japanese Canadians. These were Canadian citizens.
Mm-hmm.
And it contrasts how they were treated even after the war. No excuses. The war is over, and they still weren't treated right. And compared it to how they were treated in the States. And in some respects, they were treated better after the war in the States than they were in Canada.
Mm.
So there's all sorts of lessons we can learn from history, and there's all sorts of yes buts, and I think we've got to look at them too.
I remember we did a podcast with a couple of historians, and they basically not accused us, but they basically felt that we were being too myopic and that we're not seeing the big picture because we focus just on the local story. Do you think that criticism is warranted?
No, I think you've got to look at the big picture, but I think sometimes by looking at the forest, you miss the trees. And when it comes right down to it, history is about people.
Right.
And I think we've got some excellent, like Linfield Hodgins. He's written extensively about Camp X, but not just the big picture. He talks about individuals and what happened. And I think that's what really brings the story to life. And that's how, with me, the history teachers and people inspired me, is by talking about how it affected people. And did you know so-and-so? And did you know what they did at that time? And can you imagine being in their shoes?
You bring up you brought up Lynn as an example, but Lynn's getting on. Who's going to carry the torch on Camp X after he passes? There isn't much down there. You go down to the lake, and what do we see? Is we see 3 flags on a little bit of a monument, but the entire site is gone.
He has recorded it, and there are people that I'm sure will carry it on. I hope.
It'd be very interesting to if you ask the average person locally, for example, when the Germans surrendered, where did the communication go first? Who got that communication? And I would say it'd be, I'm pretty well positive if we polled 1,000 people, none of them would say Camp X.
Yep, and we were down there when Lynn and North Shore Radio Club was involved, and they did a recreation of the transmission from Bletchley Park to there by Morse code, and really quite interesting to see and imagine the technology of the time.
Yeah, you bring up a couple of organizations and people who are not the sort of sanctioned historical groups. But I think you alluded to genealogy. So there's the Genealogical Society, there's the Ham Radio Group. Can you talk about some of these groups that have an interest in history and that are giving a local flavor?
Well, I'm a member of what used to be known as Ontario Genealogical Society and their Durham Region branch. They now call it Ontario Ancestors. They decided that most people don't know what the word genealogy is, I guess. And Ontario Ancestors nails it down, but they deal with more than just Ontario families. But to me, that's a fun group in that the people are actually involved in research that belong to it. So they are all amateur historians of a sort. Most of them are not just name collectors. And it's one thing to know that your grandfather's name, whatever it was, but to know that he was involved in Lundy's Lane, to know that one of your relatives I know was involved in basketball. And for some people that might be interesting. Me, I don't, who cares about basketball? But other people might find it quite interesting that you're related. But if you can build that string, and it leads to all these surprising bits of history. And you were saying one of your relatives was in the staging camp in England when they had the riots after the war.
Yeah,
And-
well, that one's an interesting story because he like a lot of Canadians got conscripted, which really Borden had a lot of problems with that. It was a political reason to get that next group of conscripted soldiers, so they did that. Most of them ended up not actually serving; they just marched around in England and then they got stuck there for a long time because Americans were given priority on those ships to go back to Canada. So what they had in that camp in Wales, they had a serious riot. But my father was off to Liverpool where he met his first wife, which is one of the 44,000 British brides that came back. What's interesting is if you go onto Google Earth, you can actually see that house that this his first wife was born in. But so yeah, so what happened when he was away, enjoying his marriage or whatever, they had a serious riot and 4 Canadians were killed. So which is, a lot of people don't realize that it was in Ryle. So yeah, but again, you know, you don't have to know. You don't have to have someone in that's a direct descendant of something as
No.
illustrious as basketball or and another relative's 5-pin bowling. Those are interesting things. Everybody's got some kind
Yes.
of relative that's an interesting story, and some of them. Like one of the projects I'm involved with is we're called citizen historians. And what we do is we capture, it's a Cornell University project, and we record the history of people of the separation of British India in 1947.
Mhm.
So people who got relocated in Pakistan or Bangladesh or India or elsewhere. So there's this massive migration of people, the largest in history. And what they've decided that it was really important to do is to capture their stories. And it's not necessarily from the person who actually did the relocation from, say, Calcutta to Bangladesh or elsewhere, but it could be their relatives. So this has been a massive project. And because there's a group of people that said it's important, it's part of our history to record those horrible experiences. And I know
And a lot of it was very horrible.
it was terrible. And I was doing some research on genealogy and the relatives that left Ireland right after the famine in I think 1852. And then I started doing more genealogy stuff on my mother's side, Irish and more Irish. Like, okay, I have this one German relative, but they all, left. But what's interesting is that the Irish, I believe, virtually did a wake when the person left because they seemed to cut the ties with their relatives. They off they went, so which is kind of an interesting phenomenon. I don't think the stories have survived through that group of people, but I'm just saying in the Indian thing, they're trying to capture those stories.
But again, too, with modern technology, with the internet's making more sources available, and even technologies making new methods available. For example, you might not know for sure where you came from in Ireland, or even that you came from Ireland.
Right.
But now you can take a DNA test and it will tell you that you came from Ireland.
Right.
You may think you came from Germany, and you take the test and you find out you're Spanish or whatever.
Well, yeah.
There's a degree of uncertainty with the test. I'm not saying that they're deterministic, but combine that with the paper, and it does show that history isn't just made up. When you do, and I know with my research, and I've taken a DNA test, the stuff in general tends to all line up. So it does say that, yes, there is proof to that story.
Now, on that issue of data,
Yes.
that 21andMe was bought out by the billionaire Richard Branson last
Yes.
week.
Yep.
Any concerns about that data being misused or?
None whatsoever.
Okay.
And it's the same with history. I think it's something that is a common good and it belongs to society. And with our DNA, I've tested with all the major companies. I've
Okay.
also shared to some third-party companies, including some commercial ones,
Okay.
and just signed it over. And yes, I agree to everything,
Right.
because I think we all have a duty. Could they make a discovery based on my data? Sure.
Yeah.
All the power to them. That might save a life. And if I can, by contributing my DNA, can help on it, I think it's almost a duty. Some
Okay.
people get hung up on privacy.
Right.
I think it becomes silly almost, in that if you're a cousin of me and you're concerned about the privacy, too late. Bob's already given his data, and that includes your data.
The cat's out of the bag.
Cat's out of the bag. And I think we've got to take advantage of it. And I think the discoveries that are going to come rolling out of this are going to be immense for medicine.
Now, we're going to wrap up, Bob, but I want to touch on what are some of the local topics that we'd like to explore. Is there anything on top of mind that we'll be talking about?
Nothing ever happened in Oshawa.
Okay. We
Yes,
had
there's lots.
the general strike is one of the
Yes.
items.
Yep.
We can talk about different personalities
Yes.
in that has happened. It's Black History Month right now in February. Perhaps that could be something that we can look at.
Yep.
I think you have an interesting theory on some of the Native connections.
Yep.
Obviously, people came before
First Nations.
First Nations situation. It's too bad Grant couldn't. We can reach out to Grant on his excellent work on the trails, and that he did research on.
Place.
Yeah, the carrying place. So you don't know. We're open to suggestions. We're open to people who have a passion on this as well. It's not just a me and you show. It's
No.
this show is to talk about inspiring people to do citizenship citizen historians look for the story, uncover the story. And you know what? We may get some things wrong. We may.
Oh, never.
But we're not.
I guess that was royal we. You were talking about yourself.
Yeah, that's right. With the royal we. Yeah, but I think one of the roles is to fill in the gaps and
yes,
using
and to encourage discussion and thought.
Yeah, and you know what? I don't know, because we stumbled across a few things. So, like I said, it's not we have any kind of fascination with war, because any stuff we did on the First World War and the War of 1812, we really did try to look at the issue holistically.
One of our major features of that was talking about the victory gardens.
Yep.
And how they were encouraged, and how that was one of Oshawa and the civilians' big input to the war is growing their own food. And people talk about war as in fighting. We tended to stay away from that. We talked about more the changes in civil society, the victory gardens, and how we can grow the food today.
Mm-hmm.
I've already got my seeds ordered for this spring.
Bob, speaking of looking back, like the pandemic was a major thing, but to get information on people locally and what happened to them and how the Oshawa community dealt with the pandemic on the first one, I think that's a real serious challenge, because if there's a blind spot in Canadians, is that any discussion, any knowledge of that pandemic. I've seen stuff stateside, but I haven't really seen, and I'm sure there's got to be stuff. But.
And I think that's one thing that we're trying to do, is provoke debate and thought about it. Like we joke about making errors, and I always love it when somebody corrects me. Mm-hmm. Either I learned something, I am wrong, and bingo, or I can teach them that, oh no, maybe. But I find most often it's option number 3. Whereas, well, neither of us is 100% right.
Yeah.
And by putting together the different viewpoints, you come up with a better viewpoint.
Yeah, I think so. So we'll come up with a theme on each show, and we encourage people to let us know what topics that they think they would like to see, and if there's some writers or monographs or papers that you suggest that we look into. Happy to do that. And again, it's not meant to be the great white guys that the rulers. We want to be as diverse and gender diverse and as much as possible. So there's a lot of hidden history that could be out there.
Yes.
Perhaps this can inspire somebody who's got a bunch of change in their pocket that may be able to put some money up towards a fellowship or scholarship towards for local students to do focus on their degrees on history.
But just to make clear, we're not asking that it come to us. We're asking that they consider helping.
And you know what, maybe
in their own way.
Yeah, maybe we could set up some kind of GoFundMe thing. It might be very easy, but unfortunately, local newspapers. That's a tough one. It used to be that we had real newspapers locally, and now we have basically a paper that mostly has advertising or flyers. So that we can't count on, and there's no QR codes on telephone poles saying what that location was and significance, because things are getting ripped down, things are being replaced, and the story is lost on what was there before. So like I remember.
But onwards and upwards, we do learn over time, and we learn especially when we stop and consider. So I think that's what we should do.
Okay, well, I think this is quite entertaining, Bob. Thanks for your time, and we shall keep everyone informed on the next episode and the theme. Thanks again.
Thank you.